We are just the neurotic consciousness of the world economy.
Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video, I'll be tackling the following topics: modern despair, the urge to log off, and our fading nostalgia for cyber utopia. I'll take excerpts from an upcoming book by RU Sirius entitled The Freaks and the Machine, while hinting at what might be in Matt Christman's upcoming book for Zero, a book tentatively entitled Behold a Fail Horse. Before I describe what cyberpunk is, before I talk about the genre called cyberpunk, or the buggy video game and the memes it spawned, I want to tell you about the first time I ever heard the term. It was early in the year 1991, and I was working as a canvasser for a nonprofit organization called Osberg. I found out about cyberpunk when I knocked on the door of an interesting group of young people while I was out on turf collecting checks and signatures. They were recreating Bohemia in a small house in southeast Portland. They had a disco ball hanging from the living room ceiling, and there were bongs on the coffee table. They were a little older than I was, mid-20s maybe, and I seemed to hit it off with one of them. He was a slightly plump, gay, would-be science fiction writer who wanted to explain two big ideas he had picked up. The first big idea was that we were already living in a cyberpunk dystopia, already living in virtual reality. He said that the world had actually ended years earlier. It had blown up in the 60s during the Cold War. What we were living in now, he said, was some fake world generated by computers or television waves or something. We were living in an apocalypse papered over by magazine advertisements and VHS tapes and electromagnetic impulses. But he said, the genre of cyberpunk was an indication that the truth about the apocalypse was breaking through. There was, he said, a bubblegum crisis. That is, the power of pop culture was faltering. Cyberpunk novels were really instruction manuals for how to live in the desert of the real, in post-apocalyptic America. Cyberpunk was telling us how we would all be living in the very near future. Today, when my 16-year-old son hears the term cyberpunk, he thinks of a middle-aged Keanu Reeves and error messages. He thinks of Cyberpunk 2077 and has no idea that Keanu was in a movie called Johnny Mnemonic, or that cyberpunk was once a controversial, some even say radical, science fiction experiment. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and click that bell. And you should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Patrons get access to our behind-the-scenes parrot room discussions, where we let our hair down, dish out gossip, or go into the weeds on topics such as the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, imperialism, and the critical theory of Bernard Morton Capel. You'll also get access to our podcasts on From Crisis to Communization, Reform and Revolution, and the history of the Russian Revolution, just as soon as I can coordinate times to record with Danny and or my kids. Your support makes videos like this one possible. Thanks for watching. Knowing about the genre as I do, being familiar with a few of the novels and having been online since 1993, it makes sense to me that a cyberpunk video game would be full of bugs, that it would constantly crash. And that's because, for me, the genre of cyberpunk is defined as much by RU Sirius and the magazine Mondo 2000 as it is by William Gibson or Bruce Sterling. In his upcoming book, The Freaks and the Machine, Ken Goffman, also known as RU Sirius, describes how Mondo, and by extension, cyberpunk, came to be. By the time we reached the mid-80s and the start of Mondo, very little appeared to be left of the irrational exuberance of the 60s left anarchic psychedelic counterculture, or the certainty that a novel mutation and revolution was about to occur. The cultural dynamics around any sort of movement were so disparate that many of us felt left to our own devices, to make a life out of what remained, or to look to something new to change the situation, like extreme technology, like far-out science, anything.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
That cyber optimism is today as dead as the psychedelic optimism of the 60s was in the 90s. But whereas the psychedelic 60s were countered by Reaganism and the dare to say no to drugs, yesterday's cyber utopian dreams received not resistance, but exorbitant public and private investment. Today we are all cyberpunks. We're all living in a world where the sky above the horizon is the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. The bubblegum crisis is over. There is no mainstream popular culture left. There is no central authority, no universally recognized face upon which to draw a mustache. Today, resistance has become participation. Today, self-expression has become conformity. A few days ago, I was talking to Matt Christman about his upcoming book, Behold a Fail Horse, and he told me that what he wanted the book to be about, what he wanted the book to be, was a guide for people living in this post-political moment of despair. I suggested that it might be a self-help book, and he reluctantly agreed. The message for our moment, according to Christman, is that we need to accept that we have experienced a failure.
So let's talk grill pilling. Now, I started calling myself grill pilled a couple months ago, basically as the campaign for Sanders fell apart and as the mummified remains of Imperator Joseph Robinette Biden were strapped to a chariot and led through the forum. And it was my attempt to express my, pretty much instantaneous disenchantment from the Democratic presidential election.
What I would add to this message that Christman is still formulating is that we should take a long view on this failure. We should accept that it is a failure that goes back at least to Occupy Wall Street, if not to May of '68 or to 1919. Once we admit to these failures, we can start to see how our reactions to them have had a material impact on the development of the world and on world capitalism. The development of cyberpunk can't be directly traced back to the history of Marxism, but it is possible to see that the literary genre was a reaction to the same historical forces from which the old Frankfurt School philosophers sprang. It's easy to see this because, like everything else in the 90s, the cyberpunk movement was self-conscious. In the 1992 book Storming the Reality Studio, Larry McCaffrey published essays in critical theory and postmodern theory alongside cyberpunk short stories. Excerpts from Gibson's Neuromancer were published alongside excerpts from Frederick Jameson's essay Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Both were originally published in 1984, and both began by announcing that we now live in a world where progress, where the possibility for a new horizon, has been foreclosed. In Neuromancer, the first line is, "The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel." Rather than the sky, we are faced with a screen, an impassable void created by the failure of our own images to depict reality. And Jameson's essay begins, "The last few years have been marked by an inverted millenarianism, in which premonitions of the future, catastrophic or redemptive, have been replaced by senses of the end of this or that, the end of ideology, art, or social class, the crisis of Leninism, social democracy, or the welfare state, etc., etc." Taken together, all of these perhaps constitute what is increasingly called postmodernism. The aim of the cyberpunk movement, as it was written into existence on the pages of Mondo 2000, and the aim of Frederick Jameson's essay were essentially the same. They both can be summarized by one of the last lines from Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. The aim was to hold to the truth of the world space of multinational capital so that we may again begin to grasp our positioning as individual and collective subjects and regain a capacity to act and struggle, which is at present neutralized by our spatial as well as our social confusion. When Mondo 2000 was published in 1989, the way to hold true to the truth of multinational capital and regain a capacity to act was to jump into the machines of finance capital and trip out on the experience. What we're discovering now is that once we're in the machines, once we're jacked in and surfing, we only lose our subjectivity faster. Rather than becoming cyberpunks who can catch and then ride the wave in order to challenge the very order we rely upon for our self-expression, we have become the data we are supposed to be stealing or subverting. In 1991, I met a would-be science fiction writer who told me that World War III had already happened, that everybody was already dead or had never been born, and that the world we knew was a computer simulation. He told me there would be a crisis, that the simulation would start to fall apart, and that individuals who could understand the simulation, who knew how to hack into and alter the machine code, would lead a revolution. But what I didn't think through at the time was that if we were really already dead, then hacking the code would only speed up a second death, would only speed up the dissolution of the remnants of who we were.
Gibson begins his novel Neuromancer with the following sentence, and I consider it the best first sentence in 20th century American literature. I hate to even use the word literature about this stuff. The Neuromancer being a work of what I call near future fiction, a work that projects, as does the movie Blade Runner, the near future of possible social developments based on very close analysis of current trends. In any case, the first sentence of the novel goes like this. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. And we have televisions. It is a stupid strategy to think that you can turn them off. All that can happen is they can turn you off. You can't turn them off.
The other option today is to try to find each other and through that process reinvent each other. But as Roderick says, that doesn't mean we can simply turn away from our TV sets, log off from the internet, and ignore the reality of global capitalism as we return to our gardens or as we start to take the grill pill. That world of global capitalism is more real than our private lives. As Jameson says, capital is a truth, and we have to contend with that truth. But as RU Sirius says, after Cyberpunk, ours is a world where the dominant comfort narrative in games and movies for young people is an endlessly repeated story of colorful individualistic punk revolutionaries overthrowing dystopian authoritarian corporate states exactly like the ones in which we live. This is what it looks like when the bad kids take all the good toys for themselves and leave us bereft in a crude and contemptuous caricature of the utopia we strove to make real. Sirius says, we reached the shining celestial city on the hill and found a claustrophobic, epic mirage. Be careful what you wish for. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.